You have it all wrong about hammocks. What's up, everybody? I'm Dan and welcome back to Backpacking Adventures, where we talk about everything backpacking, hiking, and gear. And if those interest you, consider subscribing and make sure you hit that bell notification so you don't miss a thing. Over the years, I get a lot of comments and questions about hammocks. Now, a lot of them include the hesitations that a lot of people have about getting into hammock camping. Most of them are misunderstandings or myths, and today I'm going to dispel 5 of those myths. And before we start, I just want to say that I'm not saying hammocks are better than tents or that tents are better than hammocks. The shelter you choose is a personal decision, and like anything else, there's pros and cons to each, so you're going to have to make that call for yourself. Just make sure you do all the research first. Personally, I don't think any one is better than the other, and I like both equally. I just want to dispel some of those myths so you just don't throw your hands up and say, I'm done, I'm not going to try hammocks. It just seems to be so difficult. Because once you actually try a good hammock system, you will see that a lot of those myths were just false. But if you're believing those myths, it's going to stop you from even starting in the first place. And that's what I want to help prevent. And as I go through these, tell me in the comments if you think or thought actually any of these were really true. Okay, let's get started. And first on the list is too many moving parts. I hear this quite frequently, that someone won't get a hammock setup because they think there are way more parts to it than a tent setup. So let's delve into this myth by comparing each component of a tent setup and a hammock setup. So in a double wall tent, you have the main body, which is basically the floor, the bug netting, and the zipper doors. Then you have the tent poles, which hold up the tent and provide structure. Then you have a rain fly. This goes over the tent and basically keeps the water out and keeps you dry inside. And then you need a sleeping pad. What this does is provide insulation from the ground to help keep you warm. And then finally you have the tent stakes, which basically just hold the tent in place. In a hammock setup, you have the main hammock body, which is the hammock that you lay in, along with the bug netting and the zipper entry. Then you have suspension, which holds up the hammock. Then you have an underquilt, which keeps the warmth in from underneath and prevents the air from blowing away the heat. Then you have stakes, which basically will hold your tent and your tie-outs for your hammock to keep everything in place. So when you think about it, both setups have a bunch of components. Sure, there are a bunch of small pieces and different kinds of hardware that each system uses, but in general, it's pretty much for the same purposes and the same. Now let's compare each component to each other, from a tent setup to a hammock setup. So then you see there's really not that much difference between the two setups, and they both have pretty much the same kind of components that perform the same functions. So you have the tent body and the hammock body. The hammock body and the tents are pretty much the same things. They both provide the same functions. It's where you lay, that has the bug netting and the doors. And with a tent, you have poles that provide structure and hold up the tent. With a hammock, you have the suspension for the hammock, along with the ridge line and the suspension for the tarp that basically holds everything up and provides structure. And with a tent, you have a rain fly that lays over your tent that provides the protection from the rain and the elements. With a hammock, you have the same thing. You have the hammock tarp, which gets pitched up over your hammock setup and provides the same exact function. In a tent, you need insulation under you, or the grounds will just suck the warmth right out of you. So you use a sleeping pad. They could be an inflatable or closed cell foam pads. There's many different options. For a hammock, you have to do the same thing, or else the air is going to suck the heat out from under you. In this case, you use an underquilt. Yes, you can use a sleeping pad, but the most common thing people use is an underquilt. And this goes under your hammock. It's kind of like a sleeping bag, but for underneath you, and that holds in the warmth. Again, sleeping pad and underquilt, they both do the same thing. And lastly, you have the stakes, which pretty much do the same thing for both setups. Yes, they both set up differently. Yes, they both have somewhat different hardware, maybe some different parts here and there, but essentially, they each have the same components that perform the same function. So in the end, there really are no more components for a hammock than there are with a tent. Now, the second myth is that hammocks are more expensive than a tent setup. Now, it is a little bit different to buy a hammock than it is to buy a tent. With a tent, you pretty much buy the whole package all in one thing. You can maybe pick the colors, but that's pretty much it. With a hammock, you can choose the color of the hammock, the design of the hammock, all the colors, everything. And you can purchase each component separately. So you could buy a netless hammock from one company, the netting from another company, and the tarp from a totally different company. Each one has their own ways that you can customize them. So it may seem a little bit overwhelming, and because there are so many choices and so many designs, it could be natural that you think it's just more expensive than a tent. Now, you can buy hammocks in sets, but even when you do, from those cottage companies, they still allow you to choose colors and different sizes and a few more customizable options, which is still a little bit different than a tent. In reality, in most cases, there's really not much difference in prices between a tent setup and a hammock setup. Now, I'm not talking about the cheapest thing you can find on Amazon for either the tent or the hammock, because you can do that and they will work. They may not last as long, but it will work. Now, I am talking about quality hammock setup and a quality tent setup without breaking the bank. We're not talking about Dyneema here. We're just talking about the regular common materials. So some of the most common tents out there are like your Nemo 2-person tent or your Big Agnes Tiger Wall tent, 2-person tent. And they can come anywhere between $250 and $400, and that would include a sleeping pad. And you can do the research on those tents yourself as well. And for a good hammock setup, you can get everything, including an underquilt, a good quality set for that same price or even lower. And actually, I'm putting another video together on a inexpensive hammock setup that is going to be way cheaper than a tent setup by far. So now in that video, I'm going to be looking at a quality hammock setup from cottage companies, not from your big box chain companies, but from a cottage company where everything's handmade, made in the USA, and it actually comes out to be a lot cheaper. So you just have to stay tuned for that video. But in all, it is really not more expensive than a tent setup. Now, I can see where that misconception comes from when you look at a hammock setup, you look at all the different colors and fabrics and types, you can customize it and personalize it to the nth degree. In a tent, you really can't do that. So again, like I said before, it could be natural to think that it's more expensive, but it isn't. Now, third on the list is nowhere to store your gear. I hear this one probably the most, that a lot of people think that really all you can do is store your gear on the ground, and that's going to be hard to even reach it or to get to it easily without getting out of your hammock. Now, you can leave everything on the ground if you want to. That's your choice. In a tent, yes, you can spread your gear all around you, but in a hammock, you can do the same thing, but in a little bit different way. I'm not comparing this to a 6-person or 8-person tent where you have tons of room to put everything and have chairs in there and everything else. This is basically comparing it to a 1 or 2-person backpacking tent, which is what most backpackers have. Now, most people keep their gear in some kind of ditty bag / dry bag. And if you don't have like a ridgeline organizer or gear loft, one of the things you can do is just simply clip your ditty bag to the ridgeline. I do that all the time. And I can easily reach it from my hammock even while laying down. So there's also ridgeline organizers, there's gear loft, there's ridgeline loft, there's all different kinds of things you can have to store your gear. You can even use something called like a gear sling or an under hammock, which goes under your hammock and you can lay your gear there. So now what about your backpack? You can easily leave it on the ground. Now what I do is I put everything in it that I'm not really gonna need throughout the night, and then I just clip it to my hammock suspension and it's up off the ground and out of the way. And you can think of that as putting your backpack in your tent's vestibule. So being in a hammock and with my gear lofts and my ridgeline organizers and clipping everything onto my ridgeline, I've never had any problem with accessing any of my gear at any time that I needed it. And to compare it with my Z-Packs Altiplex tent, which is a 1.5-person tent, I really just put all the gear around me or above my head and I just reached up to get it anyway. So it was actually pretty much the same. Now, number 4, you have less space in your hammock setup than in a tent. And this has to do with the overall space in the hammock setup. One of the comments I get the most about space inside of a hammock is that what if it rains? They always think that they're stuck laying in their hammock while it's raining. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. They think that the hammock itself is the only shelter, but it's not. You have the tarp. And when it's raining and when it's in porch mode, you have tons of space. Just look at all the space you have under here. And don't forget, the tarp is part of your shelter and you have all the space underneath it. You can sit in your hammock like I'm doing right now. You can lay in your hammock if it's raining. You can have a camp chair if you're one of those people that carries a camp chair, and you can sit under your tarp. You can cook your meal under here if it's raining. You just have ample amount of space. Now, if it's raining really hard and the wind is blowing the rain in, then you may have to pitch your tarp down and shut the doors to keep the rain out. Well, you still have tons of room. You can still walk around underneath it. You can still sit on your stool. You can sit in your hammock, obviously, and lay in your hammock or sit on the ground. You can still cook your meals. You can do a lot of things in your hammock setup that you really can't do in your tent. If it's raining and you're in a tent, you're confined in that little space for the duration of the storm. So the next time you think of being in a hammock in the rain and that you're confined to just this space, just remember, you're not. You have the whole tarp area that you have available to you, which in most cases is way more room than a tent. So now this is off the subject, but I'm sitting here and I'm doing my video and a car pulls up. And as it turns out, someone who came by earlier saw me here sitting in my hammock, and they saw, I guess, the gear on this picnic table that's here, because I'm in a local park, and they thought I was homeless, and they felt so bad. They went home and they got a tent for me, and they got all kinds of food and everything for me. It's just wonderful that there's still people in this world. Now, obviously I don't need it, but it was just a wonderful thing that someone came out to help. Now the question is, do I look like a homeless person? Now back to the video. So the fifth one is sleeping on your side. Now I hear this probably, I would say the most about any myth about hammock camping is that you can't sleep on your side. And if you understand how a real hammock works, I'm not talking about a lounging hammock, the ones that make you sleep like a banana, like an Eno hammock. I'm talking about a hammock that's made for sleeping, where you lay diagonally in it, so then you can have an absolute flat lay. If you have a flat lay, guess what? You can turn on your side, you can roll over on your stomach, and if you need to, you can toss and turn all night long. Now at home, when I'm sleeping in the bed, I find that I toss and turn a lot. Now when I'm in a hammock, I don't. I just fall asleep, and I actually sleep a little better, well, I should say a lot better, than in my mattress. And I just don't feel the need to toss and turn, but every once in a while, I do lay on my side. So yes, you can lay on your side, you can toss and turn to your heart's content, provided you're in the correct kind of hammock. So now, did I change your mind about getting a hammock system? Did I dispel some of those myths that were preventing you from purchasing one? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video and you found it helpful, make sure you subscribe and give it a thumbs up and share. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.